So welcome everybody to this EA Zoom meeting. I'd like to thank Linda and the rest of the EA Zoom community for inviting me to this. We're going to be talking today about the cycle between Jupiter and Uranus. So the cycle between Jupiter and Uranus is one of the most dynamic and dramatic cycles in astrology, really. And we're in a peak phase this year. So I have a pretty good amount of information to be sharing, but in case people do have questions or anything while I'm talking, you can feel free to ask me. But I think there's going to be time at the end where you can ask questions, is my understanding. So as everybody knows, if you're following the news at all, you know, every single day we have really unexpected, shocking events occurring. And so it makes perfect sense given that that Jupiter and Uranus are two of the biggest factors we have going on in astrology this year. So we're dealing with the opposition. And as you know, that's considered to be the most challenging aspect in astrology due to its polarization and the tension of its opposites. So we have, Jupiter in Libra, the home of Jupiter and Libra, the home of Venus, and Uranus and Aries, the home of Mars, opposite one another. And then in the year ahead, they're going to switch traditional rulers. So your Jupiter will go into Scorpio, the home of Mars, and Uranus will go into Taurus, the home of Venus. And of course, those of you that practice evolutionary astrology would see Jupiter entering Scorpio as being ruled by Pluto. But it is interesting from a traditional perspective that they're switching rulers like that, with Venus and Mars switching signs. So if you're following the news, you know we're in a period of just massive polarization, not only those of you in the United States, but all across the world right now. We've got a surge of nationalism, including white supremacism. Many have said we haven't seen since the 1930s, which was the last time Uranus was in Aries, and things like Hitler and the Nazis were going on and everything. So whether it's fear of terrorists, fear of immigrants or refugees, fear of tyrants, there's just immense fear being projected at an other of one sort or another throughout the world right now. So it is true, Jupiter and Uranus often do correspond in their peak phases with really immense upheavals and even violent revolutions. But their opposition is also perfect for changing what isn't working in the global kind of status quo. And if we're brave enough to step into what Jupiter and Uranus have to offer, they support courage and passion and spirit in the face of the unknown that can open us up to the sort of breakthroughs that can really ultimately transform the collective worldview. So in the United States of America, our country, for those of you that live here at least, was born with a sweeping type of revolutionary fervor we associate with Jupiter and Uranus. So this image of Patrick Henry shouting, "Give me liberty or give me death," is from March 23rd of 1775. This is when Uranus was at the very final degree of Taurus, and Jupiter was at about 16 degrees of Taurus, coming towards a conjunction. A month after this was a shot heard around the world that began the Revolutionary War, and the USA went full on into its War of Independence as a new cycle between Jupiter and Uranus began. So this idea of liberty or death really resonates with Jupiter and Uranus. They can incite this sort of burning desire for freedom and breaking out of old constraints that can inspire us to leap into the promise and potential of a future unknown, rather than hold back due to fear of the destruction that comes with change. And we're going to see, as I talk about this more, that the United States being connected so deeply to the Uranus-Jupiter cycle, it's not surprising that we're at such a pivotal moment of U.S. history right now with everything going on, and they're at the opposition right now. So as I said, this happened with Uranus and Taurus. And the very next time that Uranus entered Taurus was in the 1850s. And this was a decade before the Civil War. Frederick Douglass gave a speech that resonates with the meaning of Jupiter and Uranus on July 5th, 1852. And at this time, Jupiter and Uranus were opposite. And interestingly, Uranus was in Taurus and Jupiter was in Scorpio, just like it's going to happen in the year ahead. Frederick Douglass, he's very exemplary of the sort of meaning we associate with Jupiter and Uranus, because he was born a slave, but he rose to become a leading intellectual, inspirational orator, and human rights activist. So the Civil War is a decade away, but all the tensions that were leading into it were in place at this time. And the Civil War really almost happened. But a couple of years before this, there was this thing called the Great Compromise you've probably heard of, which sort of delayed the outbreak of the Civil War about a decade. And part of that Great Compromise, to sort of appease the southern states that later became the Confederacy, was the Fugitive Slave Act. And that was designed to increase punishments against anybody who was helping to protect or harbor people who had run away from slavery. And so Frederick Douglass gave this speech sort of in that time period. And it was actually at a women's rights convention organizing for women to gain the right to vote at this time. So I'm just going to actually read to you just a part of this speech, just because it resonates so much with Jupiter and Uranus. And when you hear it, you can hear how this exact speech could be said right now. And but I would encourage, I'm only going to read a very small part of it, so I'd encourage you to look it up online. There's lots of versions of this you can find online. So this is the words of Frederick Douglass right here. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. So just like that was a time period of Jupiter being opposite Uranus, we're in that exact period right now. And what I use to interpret planetary phases is basically a modification of the 8 lunar phase cycle that was developed by Dean Rudyard, which all of you that study evolutionary astrology are familiar with, because it's basically the same idea that Jeff Green took and modified to fit the evolutionary astrology paradigm. I'm not going to go through explaining all of this right now, but it's important to realize we're at one of the peak phases. We're kind of right on the threshold of entering the full phase, kind of at the very, very end of the gibbous phase. It's also important to realize, that astrology like this works as like a natural cycle of growth. So it's not like things are always expanding and growing on forever. They're going to grow, reach a peak, and then begin to wane, release, decompose, and then, basically like reseed future growth. So the cycle of Jupiter and Uranus altogether takes 14 years. And so we experience the beginning of the cycle and the opposition of the cycle basically every 7 years or so. The union and the opposition of Jupiter and Uranus every 7 years, that tends to be the most dramatic manifestations of the cycle. And we associate these phases with really dramatic breakthroughs that sort of dredge up suddenly from the depths of the zeitgeist. So the cycle, actually, the current cycle we're in began back in 2010, 2011. And so you might want to think about, what was going on for you in 2010, 2011. That was the beginning of the current Jupiter and Uranus cycle. And right now we're, again, right on the cusp of the full phase. Earlier in the year, we sort of had, Jupiter did oppose Uranus and it kind of moved into the full phase, but then it retrograded back out. So we're still in the gibbous phase right now. And that gibbous phase in evolutionary astrology, it's about gaining humility and preparing the soul to interact in society as an equal in order to effectively express and integrate whatever vision we're developing, into that surrounding society and context. And so Jeff Green really emphasizes that idea of humbling, which is needed to make adjustments to really overly willful and inflated desires. So that idea of overly willful, inflated desires, that's really part of the shadow of Jupiter and Uranus and something we have to kind of be careful for. And so that humbling as part of the gibbous phase is actually really important. And the purpose behind that is so you can kind of analyze where you are, what's the surrounding social environment, how can you fit whatever kind of vision you have into some sort of work or service that's actually needed by other people around you. So this is actually where we are right now, just in the cycle. And you can see that Jupiter's now in the last decan of Libra. We got Saturn literally stationing right now as I'm talking, and Jupiter's kind of coming into that waning sextile. One of the things just to recognize with this is how many planets are actually in waning cycles right now with each other. So Jupiter and Saturn especially being waning to Neptune and Pluto. The other really important thing is that Jupiter is currently reconnecting and reigniting the square between Pluto and Uranus. So that Pluto-Uranus square really dominated astrology from 2010 to 2015. And it was all about all the explosive and cathartic breakdowns and dismantling breakthroughs going on in world structures. And so this last phase between Jupiter and Uranus, it's really kind of the very final, last, really dramatic part of that Pluto and Uranus square. So, earlier, just not too long ago, we had the final square between Jupiter and Pluto. And now Jupiter's moving from Pluto to reconnect, translate the light to Uranus. Last year we had the waning square between Saturn and Neptune, the waning square between Jupiter and Saturn. We got Saturn balsamic to Pluto. So the point with all this is just, we're obviously really in the middle of this really huge dismantling and destruction going on. But we can also kind of bear in mind that what we're able to do is take responsibility for how are we contributing to the coming cycles of meaning and purpose that are going to be reborn. And especially right now, that waning sextile between Jupiter and Saturn is not going to change the world, but it's a nice thing you can work with in your life. As last year they were square, now they're sextile. They're really harmoniously able to work together right now. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here. So just to give you one example of how current events relate to this cycle. One of the biggest things we have going on around the world right now is the refugee crisis, and Syria is definitely part of that. So if we go back to what was going on at the beginning of this current Jupiter and Uranus cycle, there was a huge uprising in Syria. And then when we got to that 2013 period, which would be the first quarter square between Jupiter and Uranus, that's a time period where ISIL was taking over a lot more territory, and the Syrian government was accused of dropping chemical weapons. And then when we reached the opposition, the United States dropped the largest non-nuclear bomb ever dropped on humanity, literally at the time of the sun conjoining Uranus. And that kind of was involved with sort of retributions for the use of chemical weapons on the population. So that's just one example of how you can kind of see events lining up with this cycle pretty clearly. I won't go into this a lot because I know most of you already understand, Jupiter and Uranus, but, Jupiter is a very expansive influence as an archetype. It tends to inflate things, elevate things, amplify things. It's very generous. It's also very stabilizing. It brings coherence to things. And it also brings insight into sort of like the bigger picture of everything. And it's also known as being all about the sort of wisdom and knowledge we gain from that sort of direct experience into life. And then Uranus, in contrast, it's also very expansive. It can also amplify things, but it's much more kind of that lightning strike release of tension. It has much more of an emphasis on liberation and emancipation in a very unexpected and shocking way that can really shake things up and shatter things. It's often associated with Prometheus, especially with work of Rick Tarnas, who I'm going to cite some more as we go on here with his work on this cycle. And Prometheus is really interesting because, in myth, Prometheus created humans, brought culture to humans, stole fire from the gods to give to humans, and was ultimately punished. But if you kind of look at the way Prometheus was punished, he was chained to a rock with this eagle eating his liver. And, the eagle, it's a very Jupiterian punishment. The eagle is a symbol of Jupiter. Jupiter rules the liver. And, even though we tend to glorify Prometheus for giving fire to humans, we can also think about, what have humans actually done with that fire, which is, come close to basically destroying the planet. And so there is a sort of idea of this grand ambition and this need to really push to new horizons with Jupiter and Uranus. But there is that shadow of like hubris and this sort of unintended consequences for your actions. And so that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind with all of this that we'll get a little bit more into. It's really important to keep Saturn in mind in relation to Jupiter and Uranus. You always want to keep Jupiter and Saturn together because basically, Jupiter, unlike Uranus, isn't such a chaotic, shattering, expansive influence. It really expands and initiates within the forms and boundaries of Saturn. So as, Jupiter's kind of amplifying things and enhancing things, Saturn is, constricting and constraining things at the same time. And Jupiter's going to stay within that form for the most part. So like if, say, somebody wants to get a bunch of wealth and power, they're going to probably go about that with Jupiter, oftentimes in a very mainstream way. However, whatever Saturn kind of structures are in place within their mainstream culture, they're going to go about getting wealth and power in that way. So let's say somebody like Donald Trump, the current president, who's very Jupiter-Uranus, he's got Jupiter in Libra, trining Uranus, Sun, North Node, and Gemini, right? And he's very like that as far as a Jupiter-Uranus kind of personality. So Uranus, in contrast, will come in and just really shatter things. And what that does with Saturn is it can really open up Saturn and allow Jupiter to kind of sort of shift beyond the restrictions of Saturn. And then Jupiter can sort of shift and shift the structures of Saturn to kind of accommodate that expansion. So ideally, you can get all of these things working together. And we actually have that going on right now with the aspects, because all three of these planets are forming aspects right now and are actually all harmonious aspects, except for the Jupiter-Uranus opposition. So there's a trine between Uranus and Saturn and a sextile between Jupiter and Saturn. The way that this works as far as getting these visions, it tends to be really non-linear and intuitive and very rapid and sudden. And Jupiter and Uranus together, they really can break us free from whatever dominant culture perspectives we've had, whatever conditioning we've had from family, whatever the influences have been that have kind of been telling us to think a certain way. Jupiter and Uranus can kind of come in and expand us beyond that. And it can tend to often be really connected to something deep within our soul, especially in terms of soul desires as we work within evolutionary astrology. And so that might be just something as simple as like you hear a song you like, you hear some lyric that makes you think about something a certain way, or you just like the style of some band for whatever reason it is. And as you maybe then you start reading about the artist and you realize this philosophy they're into, which completely goes against everything you've been taught to believe, but it really resonates with you. And these things can happen really fast, and it doesn't always necessarily make sense how you connect to the information. That kind of then breaks you free of how you're formerly thinking. And ideally, these things are all working together, because if you just all of a sudden got all these huge insights or completely changing the way you're thinking, but you're not really grounded and you're not able to use Saturn to kind of ground and structure these thoughts, you could really kind of break with reality. And so ideally, you're sort of realizing and embracing this bigger expansive whole that can hold within it all of the radically shifting perceptions and experiences you're going through. And then further with evolutionary astrology, it's worth mentioning the nodes. So the south node of Uranus, being Sagittarius for everybody, basically means that everybody's Jupiter rules the south node of Uranus in their chart. And so you can always additionally look at Jupiter as revealing how the current vision of your life is shaped by these long-term memories of the soul that we associate with Uranus in evolutionary astrology. As you probably already know, Jeff Green taught that south node of Uranus in Sagittarius correlates with the era in which humanity was nomadic, whereas the north node of Uranus in Gemini correlates with all the philosophies that were created in the transition into agricultural civilizations, which is also basically how he works with the south node of Jupiter being Capricorn, which is also about all of the cosmologies that were developed in that transition from the nomadic to the agricultural societies. And, there's obviously tons of collective unconscious trauma all wrapped up in this. So as another thing going on with this is we might have these long-term soul memories of something that was really at odds with however we're being conditioned or led to believe reality works or whatever we're supposed to do. And so let's just say, for example, you live somewhere with like a dominant religion and you're having these romantic feelings or realizing something about sexual orientation that religious doctrine is calling you sinful for. There's lots of other examples, but it's basically the kind of influence that can kind of maybe reconnect you to who you really are that goes against what these conditioning forces are kind of telling you have to do or you have to think, and so forth. I'm going to go through a bunch of examples of just how the Jupiter-Uranus cycle has played out in history. And a lot of these are actually coming from the book Cosmos and Psyche by Rick Tarnas. So if you aren't already familiar with this book, it's probably one of the best single books you could buy with astrology, especially if you're interested in history and planetary cycles. And what Rick Tarnas did in this book is he didn't focus on planets being in signs. He really just looked at them as being an aspect. And all of the examples I give in this are working with the idea of Jupiter and Uranus being opposite with a 15-degree orb. What he found tracing historical events was that 15-degree orb worked really well. So it's basically 15 degrees before the opposition and then 15 degrees after the exact opposition. And the different statements I have here are just basically me paraphrasing some statements that Rick Tarnas made about Jupiter and Uranus in his book that are just good statements about what it means. I really like the one at the bottom that says, at once principled and transgressive, constantly opening to new horizons. So it has that combination of, the Jupiter principles and the transgressive Uranian influence. So as I already mentioned, our country is really connected to this cycle. And so again, it's no wonder that we're at a Jupiter-Uranus opposition right now. And all sorts of unexpected destruction, but also just there's clearly something major going on in the United States right now. We are obviously not completely sure where we're headed with all of it, except we know that clearly, you know, all sorts of forces are at odds with one another, and there's something that's going to be birthed coming out of all of this that's going on right now. So again, the United States is actually, the Revolutionary War began with Jupiter and Uranus being conjunct. The very following opposition was basically when the Revolutionary War ended. And then the very next time that they came together in like that 1788 to 1789 period, that was when the Constitution got ratified. George Washington became the first president. You know, the Bill of Rights was introduced. So it's the United States is completely linked up with this cycle, especially, you know, Jupiter and Uranus coming together and then opposing each other. There's also just emancipation is a big theme all around the world. So, you know, our Statue of Liberty was actually built, unveiled with this cycle. So when the Statue of Liberty was unveiled, Jupiter was in Libra, Uranus was in Libra. They were at the beginning of the cycle. You know, we got that Statue of Liberty. It's often associated with France. France is also associated with this cycle. At the same time, when we were introducing the Bill of Rights, the French Revolution occurred. And then you can also look, since France is also connected to this cycle, it's not surprising then that France is also really big in the news right now. And they also had a very shocking election with Macron coming to power, you know, basically creating this political party that didn't even exist before. In contrast to the United States, in that instance, it was somebody who's more of a globalist defeating a nationalist, whereas we elected a nationalist over someone that was a little bit more of a globalist. Also with, you know, other examples, the British Empire freeing slaves, the United States finally passing the 13th Amendment prohibiting slavery, and then even later finally giving women the right to vote, which has also happened to be the same time the ACLU was formed. But there's just tons of examples of this all throughout history. Another one is civil rights activism. And these examples here, I'm connecting especially to the interplay of Jupiter with Uranus and Pluto. So that time period of 1968 to 69, that in United States history had so many like riots and revolutions, and then things even just like Woodstock that was kind of shocking for people. That for some people, that was when Jupiter was again reconnecting Uranus and Pluto. So a few years before that, we had a conjunction of Uranus and Pluto in Virgo. And then in 1968 to 69, they had separated, but Jupiter came through and united with Pluto and then moved on to Uranus. And during that time period, we had, for example, the Stonewall riots, which basically created the LGBTQ movement. Not completely created it, but as a result of those riots, you know, lots of people realized they really had to mobilize, they had to organize, and a lot of groups and mobilization and action kind of came out of those riots. The American Indian movement was created in this time period. There was tons of feminist movements, women liberation conferences. And then not too long ago, an interesting one in 2013 is when Black Lives Matter was formed. And that was, again, Jupiter interacting with Uranus and Pluto. And that one was more of like a T-square. So that was when Jupiter is in Cancer, opposite Pluto in Capricorn, and then squaring Uranus in Aries. And as you probably know, Black Lives Matter was created after George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. So we can already see Black Lives Matter is still going strong and being a big influence on events. And that will definitely be continuing to happen. And then there's, you know, lots of other examples of other movements that are going on right now that will also be gaining strength and probably also being created, you know, in this next year or so. A really big thing too is just really huge revolutions in thoughts that basically on a collective level, the entire collective worldview like completely changes. So we literally went from the Earth-centered perspective to the sun-centered perspective during the alignments of Jupiter and Uranus. So again, all of these things are happening with either Jupiter and Uranus being conjoined or opposite. So Copernicus publishing his theory Later on, Kepler and Galileo supporting that work all happened with Jupiter and Uranus. Newton. So an interesting thing about this is oftentimes the things that are the really big insights that are going on right now are not really being broadcast at this like mass level. So there's always some events that are really big and innovative and revolutionary that we all kind of find out about in the news or publications or whatever. But there's also lots of things that happen that's, just somebody sitting at home. Somebody could be sitting at home in my neighborhood right now and she's like writing in her journal, and 80 years from now we're going to look back on what she's writing, as part of some, paradigm breaking masterpiece or something. A good example of that is Isaac Newton. So when he was like 22 and doing a lot of experimentation, there's that famous story of the apple falling. That was during a Jupiter and Uranus alignment. And then later on, when he got all his theories kind of came together and he was actually publishing them, was another alignment. So that's often something you see where somebody gets some kind of idea or meets somebody, and then something gets kind of sparked. And then at a later Jupiter-Uranus alignment, it kind of all really comes together and gets expressed in this really big way that actually finally really impacts the collective. Charles Darwin's another example, who's somebody that completely transformed the way people think about the world. So when he got on the boat and went off to the Galapagos Islands, most people didn't know about that at the time, but that all fed his experience that led into him eventually publishing his theory of evolution. And then in quantum physics, which was sort of one of the more recent huge transformational events in science, that also completely lined up with the Jupiter-Uranus cycle and how different theories were developed. This is also the case on a psychological level. So, similar from moving from like an Earth-centered perspective to a sun-centered perspective, in the 20th century, there was this development of the significance of the unconscious and the soul and the collective unconscious. So some events, for example, like Sigmund Freud with the interpretation of dreams, Carl Jung's period of getting pretty far out there in his mind and doing his Red Book, and a lot of thoughts that really ended up informing all of the theories he then later developed and published came about with Jupiter and Uranus. That same time period had a lot of modernist literature where people like Joyce and Proust and Stein and Lawrence Kafka Eliot, they were all doing things that really lined up very clearly with this cycle. And then later on in the 20th century, we had people like James Hillman with archetypal psychology and Stanislav Grof with transpersonal psychology that were also basically created with the Jupiter-Uranus interactions going on. And these are also, of course, interesting in terms of modern astrology because they're all pretty significant influences on modern astrology. And then also technological inventions. So aviation, literally the invention of flight, as well as leading into going into outer space, all these different events lined up with the Jupiter and Uranus cycle. Electromagnetism, the telegraph, the light bulb, first radio broadcast, first sound motion picture, first television transmission, first internet transmission. All of these things occurred again with Jupiter and Uranus alignments, conjunction or opposition, which again completely transformed the world and how people communicate. Another really good example of something that people wouldn't have known about at the time, but became, this landmark moment would be Steve Jobs and Wozniak. There's a famous story, of them working in their garage and building the first personal computer together. They were doing that again during one of these Jupiter-Uranus alignments like we're going through right now. Nobody knew about it at the time really, except their friends. But, later on it became this like really landmark, groundbreaking thing that was going on. So the other thing I want to talk about this more with the Jupiter and Uranus is a shadow of Jupiter and Uranus, which involves sort of like overextending on these grandiose ambitions and hubris, which eventually brings about a very sudden downfall. So just as quickly as Uranus can take you take somebody to the heights, it can equally bring them down just as suddenly. So a really interesting Jupiter-Uranus personality is Napoleon. He was actually born with Jupiter and Scorpio opposite Uranus and Taurus. And as I mentioned earlier, the French Revolution also occurred during the alignment of Jupiter and Uranus. And that's when he really rose to power. You know, he's like this rags to riches story because of his ability in the military. He really, you know, through that French Revolution, he just rose and rose to power to the point of he was actually declared an emperor. You know, he took over all this territory, kind of saw himself as like a modern day Alexander the Great. And at his Uranus opposition, which would be Uranus opposite his natal Uranus, so it would have also been on his Jupiter and Scorpio at the same time. That's when he was basically declared an emperor. But then he took it to the next level, and he actually even tried to invade Russia, you know, which had the Waterloo, and he had this very sudden downfall. And so that's the sort of shadow that you can look at, and it's just something to really be aware of. So at the same time that this time period we're in, it really is a time where you can really break free of old limitations and really go into this new territory for yourself. But you do just want to also keep in mind, you know, what's going on with your ambition, how is that impacting other people around you and the wider world, you know, and what's really for the highest good and all of that sort of thing. So this right here is the chart for the very final opposition that we are going to experience between Jupiter and Uranus. This is going to be on September 27th, and it's basically at 27, 28 degrees of Aries and Libra. And I just isolated this down to Jupiter and Uranus with Saturn in the nodes, because you can see here how all of them are actually all interacting with one another at this moment. In fact, it actually would form a six-pointed star, except we don't actually have anything here in the third decan of Gemini. But for example, anybody that does have something around that period, that point of Gemini, you can see how you're really kind of tapped into this, what's going on right now. Another thing is, you know, these are all, it's actually a fire triangle, grand fire trine with Saturn, Uranus in the north node. And all of these signs are all, you know, very yang, very outwardly expansive signs. And so again, that also really goes with all of the great tumult going on around the world right now. But at the same time, there's really huge potential for really incredible inspiration and really doing things that you previously not believed you could actually do. You know, kind of like the life you've always wanted to live sort of thing. These types of aspects also really support that. Right here, I'm just going to kind of, just so you can get a sense, if you want to kind of think about this cycle in your own life, these are just the dates of just the very major alignments of the cycle. So like I previously said, it began in 2010 to 2011. And if you remember, this was sort of the time period of, you know, the Arab Spring and the Occupy Wall Street movement. The Tea Party in the United States politics was also really rising to power at this time. And it's really interesting, the very first alignment was actually at the 0 Aries point. It was 0 degrees, 18 minutes of Aries in June 2010. And then later that year, there's one at the end of Pisces. And the final one at the beginning of 2011 was basically 27, 28 Pisces. So we had this sort of Aries Pisces beginning. And it'd be good to think about, you know, just what was going on in your life at that time. Especially if there's anything that was going on that was kind of really leading you into this new direction, or maybe you'd had these insights before, but you never really quite put it together, and you're starting to push yourself in this direction at that time, to really think about, you know, where you are now with those ideas, because most likely there's been really huge development. I know for myself, just because I'm actually doing this EA Zoom right now, this was basically when I first got on the EA message board and learned EA. It was at the beginning of this cycle. In the first quarter square, which is 2013 to 2014, we had Jupiter in Cancer and Uranus in Aries. And they were basically squaring at that sort of 10 degrees to 13 degrees mark. And so, again, that's another good period to really kind of think about, where were you then? What kind of crossroads were you at? What kind of structures were you being forced to kind of build? How are you kind of trying to get this vision of what you had earlier conceived of kind of more into place and more integrated in your life and all that sort of thing. And now we're at the opposition. So the very first one was December 26 of 2016 at 20 degrees of Aries and Libra. And then in March, they opposed again exactly at 22 degrees. And then, like I said, the very final opposition will be at 27 degrees of Aries and Libra on September 27th. And at that point, we will actually be in the full phase between Jupiter and Uranus for good. They won't be going back again into the gibbous phase like they just did recently. Then they're going to remain within that 15-degree orb of an opposition until September of 2018. And if you remember when I was talking about Rick Tarnas and all those examples from history I was giving, those all occurred within that 15-degree orb. So we're still going to be in range of that for another year. And then additionally, Jupiter is going to stay in Scorpio with Uranus and Taurus up through like November of 2018. So we still, even though we're, next month we're going to be having the last exact opposition, we're going to have a very strong, impactful influence of this opposition for an entire another year. And so a lot more is going to be happening that right now we don't actually know about. And then eventually they're going to actually finally begin their new cycle in Taurus. But that's not going to be until 2024. Just want to check time. Okay. So with just the last time I have left, I'm just going to mention a little bit about Jupiter and Scorpio and then go more into Uranus and Taurus and just some ideas about what the transit of Uranus and Taurus could bring about in relation to all of this, and then see any questions or comments y'all might have. So one thing that's really interesting with Jupiter going into Scorpio, so whether you're someone that thinks about Mars ruling Scorpio or Pluto ruling Scorpio, we know that Jupiter in Scorpio is definitely something that's going to take us much deeper into things. We already kind of have a lot of shadowy material getting stirred up, and Jupiter in Scorpio is going to take us even deeper. It's going to really want us to penetrate, into the roots of everything. And there's really going to be lots of opportunities for integration, because the interesting thing is Jupiter in Scorpio is going to make a lot of really interesting aspects. So it's going to, we've been having this square between Jupiter and Libra with Pluto and Capricorn, which has brought up a lot of issues around social justice and oppression and reconciliation and conflicts and all these sorts of things. Once Jupiter enters Scorpio, it's going to be moving into a sextile with Pluto. And more immediately, it's going to be moving into a trine with Neptune and Pisces. And that trine between Jupiter and Scorpio with Neptune and Pisces could be really exciting. The combination of that with it also being harmonious with Pluto, there could be a lot more integration with people's spirituality as well. We might see some more bigger, not that there hasn't already been a lot of stuff with spirituality going on with Neptune and Pisces, but if you sort of think about what's the potential of Neptune and being in Pisces, I would imagine with these aspects we're going into now, we're going to finally start seeing a lot more of that potential of Neptune and Pisces on a spiritual level. Ideally, obviously there could be the other side of that, which would be total like delusion. But There could be some really deep, kind of penetrating spiritual experiences going on. Eventually, Saturn's going to go into Capricorn, which Jupiter will be in sextile with thereby a sign. And then eventually, Uranus will go into Taurus. So at a certain point, we're going to have all the planets in these signs. So right now, everything is so yang and so like outwardly, it's so like intense with all these fire and air signs. And it's interesting to keep in mind, we're heading into this time period where it's going to totally flip. And we're going to get all these planets in yin signs and all these inwardly directed signs of water and earth. So that's a very, very different astrological atmosphere than we have going on right now. And Jupiter and Scorpio also, will probably really be testing taboos also, which could be really interesting in the way of the Jupiter-Uranus opposition kind of being about that anyway. It's kind of like Jupiter and Scorpio is going to really kind of force those kinds of conflicts and confrontations with people even more. And then ideally, as all that stuff kind of gets stirred up, there'll be some good opportunities to kind of actually do something helpful with it and, potentially heal and all that sort of thing. Uranus and Taurus, though, is a thing that's coming that's going to really, change the landscape with astrology. And it is going to take it's going to kind of barely move into Taurus, and it will move back out into Aries, and then it'll come back again. So it is going to be one of those things where it moves into Uranus and Taurus just for a little bit, pulls back out before it, finally comes back in for good. But once Uranus goes into Taurus, we're going to get Uranus in this fixed sign, this earth sign, this yin sign. It's the sign of Venus. So it's very different, obviously, than Uranus being in Aries. On this slide, this painting is by Vincent van Gogh, who was born with Uranus and Taurus. And then this text is just an excerpt from probably one of the most famous quotes out of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, who was not born with Uranus and Taurus, but Walt Whitman published Leaves of Grass with Uranus and Taurus. So one of the higher potentials I feel with Uranus and Taurus is all about connecting with the soul and spirit that's alive in nature. If you think about the paintings of Vincent van Gogh and why they're so appealing and moving to people, he has a Uranus and Taurus, and he really, expressed that spirit of nature in his work. It could hopefully be a lot more about people connecting to their bodies, the relationship between spirit and earth in our bodies, more connection to sort of our bodily senses, a lot of philosophies and art becoming more rooted in nature, earth, body, spirit kind of connections. One thing with astrology I think is interesting is we're already seeing a pretty big movement towards a more embodied astrology, kind of as we're on a threshold of this happening. So I'd imagine that would get even more extreme as far as stuff with like embodied astrology happening with Uranus and Taurus. Another thing is just this idea of the magic and power of nature, and kind of melding that with human art and ingenuity and inventions and all that sort of thing. This idea of getting knowledge through the direct experience of our senses and observation. One thing when I was looking at different things that happened with Uranus and Taurus, I had noticed that Roger Bacon published the Opus Maius in 1267. Uranus was in Taurus then. And then I happened upon this podcast that was about Roger Bacon. And it was really interesting to listen to. And just pulling some of that out, if you don't know who Roger Bacon was, he was actually a Franciscan. And he was definitely about wanting to convert people into Christianity. But he was also an alchemist. He was a magician. He was into astrology. He was one of these kind of polymath people who, recognized there's all these old, ancient, alchemical, magical, astrological texts in Greek and Arabic, and these translations I have probably aren't necessarily accurate, so I should probably learn these languages and go back and translate this material myself. which is another kind of parallel you can see right now as we're on the threshold, because that's a big thing going on in astrology right now. People going back and retranslating things, and he was doing this back in the 1200s. For example, he was really into Al-Kindi and like the influence of the planetary rays. And there's this kind of old debate and philosophy around this idea that the mind is a connection to spirit. We can only find truth through the rationalization of our mind, and that you can't trust the senses, you can't trust the body or the perceptions, because the whole material world is an illusion. And there's the other line of thought that we need to connect to the wisdom of our bodies, and within our bodies and our senses is where we discover truth and knowledge. We can find illumination through these subjective senses and this connection between our bodies and spiritual truth. And so he's somebody that kind of came in on more of that side of things, of seeing things as being interconnected, that the heavens have an influence of us, that science and spirit are linked. And there's this sort of like natural magic available in nature. And then another figure that kind of parallels him, that was born with Uranus and Taurus, would be Marsilio Ficino. He's a very famous philosopher and astrologer in the Renaissance. And if you don't know who he was a huge influence on Renaissance art. And the astrology he practiced definitely involved embodied astrology, such as creating music that you would listen to that was completely created for, let's say, like a Saturn transit or a Saturn experience. And all these sorts of things you see really coming back now as far as remediation, making like certain herbal combinations, or wearing certain colors or certain types of music, and all these sort of things that kind of reflect the planetary energies were types of things he was doing. And he also kind of went back and retranslated alchemical texts and that sort of thing. And then another really interesting example is Nikola Tesla, who was born with Uranus and Taurus. And if you're familiar with that really famous story of the waterfall with him, I think that's a great example of the potential of Uranus and Taurus. When he was a child, he saw this waterfall, and he just had this vision that I can create power out of that. And he really did grow up to create hydroelectricity. And so sort of that idea of like seeing some kind of natural phenomenon like that and getting this kind of insight into like the spirit of it and how that can maybe become something utilized, I think is a really good sort of sudden illumination that you later work towards figuring out how to actually bring it about. And the connection to the natural world, I think is really good with Uranus and Taurus. There's also, in general, Uranus and Taurus is going to most likely also be all about, how are we actually going to survive on this planet? Not just with environmental disasters or crises, but also economic. So most likely, Uranus and Taurus, you can also imagine, commerce and labor destabilizations and big dramatic changes. So for example, you think about like the stock market. The stock market, it's nothing that's actually real. It's all these sort of imagined things that we've all agreed upon to believe in. There's nothing preventing all of that stuff from really changing in a really big way. Also the idea of natural resource consumption versus protection. It was a really big sign that when we first had the Jupiter-Uranus opposition, the Standing Rock protests were going on, which kind of combines water rights and protecting water, as well as indigenous rights. And both of those things, will continue probably be really huge things with Uranus and Taurus. Some of the, ideally, hopefully there'll be really big scientific breakthroughs into energy resources that could be helpful for people, more sustainable, as well as new understanding of the physical laws and evolution that could ideally also be helpful. But if you look back at other periods of Uranus and Taurus, it's when the like African slave trade actually began during Uranus and Taurus. There were some different plagues and disease wiping things out at different points. Lots of wars over. Wars are usually fought over resources and land, but there's a lot of them if you look back through Uranus and Taurus. Even the stuff with like the Crusades and Islam versus Christianity, There's a lot of really big events that happened if you look back through time. So yeah, just basically continue, but hopefully like the higher potential of this would be actually for us to kind of figure out, how can we actually survive and survive on the planet, basically. One thing I noticed that I didn't necessarily expect, but it made more sense once I thought about it, is epic storytelling. So, for example, Dante was born with Uranus and Taurus. And then when the Globe Theater was built, which enabled Shakespeare to really get out there with more of his work, that was during Uranus and Taurus. Don Quixote was published with Uranus and Taurus. Leaves of Grass was published with Uranus and Taurus. Moby Dick, which is kind of considered the great American novel. The Grapes of Wrath. And in fact, some of those Dust Bowl events also happen in Uranus and Taurus. So it seems again like something, a transit of really big monumental events, and then people being able to convey that into maybe myth and story that can hopefully help people make sense of things. And just where I would end with this would be, instead of giving into fear about what could happen with all of this and what's going on right now, what Jupiter and Uranus does offer us, it really is, like I was mentioning before, the opportunity to really kind of create the life you've always wanted to live, really take responsibility for that. And, if you're just keeping in mind that sort of shadow of being overly ambitious, where you could maybe harm other people, there's really great inspiration, great opportunities for freedom and liberation possible with the transit. So just, I know we're at time right now, so if there's any questions or comments people have, and if not, we can kind of end it. But if people do have any questions, I'm happy to answer anything right now.
Could you please stop the share?
Okay.
Thanks.
Let me see where that is. Sorry, I'm trying to stop the share, but
it's the red section at the top.
Yeah.
The red section. Okay. That's it. Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any questions, anyone?
That was amazing. My solar return is 2 days after that perfecting opposition there, the 27th.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I've been looking at that for a long time, but thank you so much for filling it all in. Beautiful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's huge, yeah.
So, Greg, could you speak about the Jupiter-Uranus aspect in a natal chart and how that would express?
Yeah. Well, the example I gave in the presentation would be Napoleon, but you don't need to be a Napoleon. I guess that would be sort of like the ultimate manifestation in a lot of ways. I guess it's a little hard to say just because it would depend so much on the rest of the chart. But I happen to know people that have a Jupiter and Uranus opposition that are actually not rebellious people. They're actually very conforming people that have not done anything rebellious like whatsoever. So even though that might, I think, be what comes to mind, it's not necessarily the case. So yeah, I guess it's just a little bit hard to, I feel like it's a little hard to say something about that, except that the Jupiter-Uranus, the tension of that opposition would be really strong in a chart. It's something you would have to be dealing with. There's probably some philosophy, like the meaning of life and connections of different ways they view life might be really connected to some kind of like Uranian groups in one way or another. So maybe they're really conforming to something, some kind of ideal, or maybe they're really rebellious. With EA, I would especially think of the way Jeff Green talks about like Aquarius, and you might really conform to something from the past, or you might be really more rebellious, and they might also kind of go through some real sudden shifts in their worldview. But like I said, I do know some people that have it that are not like that at all. And I think that's, so it really depends on the rest of the chart. Sorry, it's not a good answer, but
That's great. Thank you. I was just thinking that if Jupiter and Uranus were in favorable aspect with Saturn, that there would be a good chance of actually bringing that vision and building something out of it.
yeah, I think so. Yeah, if you've got Saturn involved, right, in the aspect with those, definitely. So like, it could be kind of more harmonious, like you're really able to kind of structure stuff, or maybe if it's maybe hard, maybe there's some big challenges that kind of force you to do things at certain points that aren't always pleasant. But yeah, if you have those all in aspect, definitely. And that's what I would see as a big potential right now, with them all being an aspect to you, that you really can be responsible to really structure things in a way to really bring about a lot of really inspiring changes for yourself and really break free of old limitations.
Great, thank you. Any final questions from anybody?
I kind of wanted to just mention, because you had talked about the opposition earlier in the presentation, and I have Uranus opposite my Mars. And to add on to that, Jupiter is returning for me when it goes into Scorpio. So I don't know, I just wanted to mention that opposition
with Mars. Yeah, so that's a big thing to deal with. I mean, I have Venus opposite Uranus, and that's been a lifelong lesson. That's definitely been difficult at times. But yeah, so I mean, if you're dealing with Mars or Venus or Mercury opposite Uranus, you know, there's a certain level of, well, it can play out in all kinds of different ways. But I think a good way to work with it, I think, is the more you can kind of get yourself involved in big liberating activities or things that are really inspiring to you, or like activism, or really taking action on some of the bigger insights you have about things, that at least is you're kind of working with the energy, and it's less likely to play out in more difficult ways, I feel like, because you're kind of working with it a little bit more. But yeah, there's that's kind of a Mars opposite Uranus is a different thing, but you definitely need to be, you need to kind of make friends with Uranus, basically. I mean, I feel like in my life, that's what I've worked on doing with having Venus opposite Uranus. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I feel like that, like with my truth, like, you know, following that truth inside my own being, like with the activism thing that you were talking about, and like directing my energy where it's, you know, where I feel most called to, you know, not wasting it on all of this, you know, garbage that you can see out in the media and stuff like that, you know, just really staying true to myself. So thank you.
Yeah. Welcome.
Okay, so thank you. And would you all please thank Gray Crawford?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Gray.
Thank you, Gray. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you again soon.
Thanks, Gray.
Thank you, Gray.
Bye, everyone.